To test your apps, you'll need either a physical device, a phone or a tablet, or a virtual device that you can create for free and run on the Android emulator. To create virtual devices from within Android Studio, start with an Android Studio project open. Then go to the menu and choose Tools, Android, AVD Manager. A virtual device is sometimes called an AVD for Android Virtual Device. If you've already created a virtual device or two, or if this happened during the installation process, this display will look a little bit different. You'll see a listing of your devices. Either way, you should see a button labeled Create Virtual Device. Click it to get started. When you create a virtual device, there are two major selections to make. The first is the profile. That's the size of the screen and its pixel density. The pixel density, which is a very important concept in Android, is the number of pixels per inch. The default selection, as of the date of this recording, is a Nexus 5, and it shows on the right that this device has a width of 1080 pixels and a height of 1920, and it has a density of 420 and then something called DPI. The DPI measurement in Android stands for Device Independent Pixels, and it's a way of measuring screens that evens out the differences between devices and makes it easier to design screens that look good on multiple screens. I'll talk more about device-independent pixels in the course on laying out your screens for Android developers. Android Studio includes profiles for all of Google's phones, that is, the Nexus and the Pixel devices. Under Phone, you'll see all of the Nexus devices here, and under Tablet, you'll see devices like the Nexus 9 and the Pixel C. There are also generic profiles that you can start with, including one for a 7-inch tablet and one for a 10.1-inch tablet, and then a variety of different sizes and pixel densities for different phones. You can create new hardware profiles or import them from here too. Or if you already know which profile you want to use, you can simply type it into the text box. I'll type Nexus 9, and there's that profile. Now, I'm going to create a device that emulates the Nexus 6P, so I'll type that in and choose that profile and click Next. The next step is to select an API level. As I described, each API level matches up with a version of Android. API level 24 is for Android 7 Nougat. And you'll see that there are a couple of different API versions available. There's one for 64-bit devices and one for 32-bit. You'll also see under x86 images that there are other versions that are simply labeled Android 7, while the recommended ones have Android 7 with Google APIs. I recommend always using virtual devices that have the Google APIs built in. That will let you do things on a virtual device like adding accounts and authenticating them against Google's authentication system. So you can actually read email on a virtual device with the Google APIs version. Also, today, I recommend using 64-bit devices. That emulates most of the flagship devices that are out on the market as of late 2016. In addition to x86 images, there's also a category called Other Images. I do not recommend using these images. These are based on the ARM architecture and are very slow. To get the best speed out of the Android emulator, you should always use Intel-based images, and you'll be using that Haxum software that I installed earlier when you run these devices. If you don't have the system image you need, you can download it from here, but I already have my system image installed, so I'll select it and click Next. I've already chosen my profile and my API level. Now I can set some other properties. The startup orientation for a phone-style device will be Portrait, and for a tablet style it'll be Landscape, but you can switch that if you like. You'll also have a device frame by default, and I recommend keeping that on. You'll be able to emulate the camera and network functionality, and you'll also be able to emulate different graphics handling mechanisms, either hardware-based or software-based. This is where you assign the amount of memory that will be allocated to this virtual device. The default is 1.5 gigabytes. If you're working on a development computer with limited memory, you can reduce this pretty easily. I can change this, for example, to 1024 megabytes, or I can use GB and it would just switch to 1 gigabyte. And again, in most environments that'll do fine, and it might allow you to run more virtual devices at the same time. I recommend leaving the VM heap and the internal storage to their defaults. And then, if you want to work with an emulated SD card, you can set it to some value. In real life, SD cards tend to be in the gigabytes, not the megabytes, 16 gigabytes and up. But if you try to set an emulated SD card at that higher size, you'll see that the startup for the virtual device can be very slow. So only assign the amount of memory to the SD card that you really need. Finally, you should always leave this option turned on, Enable Keyboard Input. This will allow you to type values in from your keyboard rather than having to use the soft keyboard in the virtual device itself. When you're finished setting all of your properties, click Finish, and that will create the device. You can run the device from right here by clicking on the launch icon, or you can go back to your project and click the Run icon on the toolbar, or choose Run and then Run App. I'll click the icon, and it shows me that I have a virtual device available now, but it's not connected, and that means it's not running yet. So I'll click OK, and then wait a few moments for the virtual device to start up. When you start the virtual device, a new window will appear named Run, and this will be showing you messages about what's going on in the background as the virtual device starts up. One of the most important messages to look for is the one that says HAX is working and emulator runs in fast vert mode. Now, this is using some abbreviations, but it's basically telling you that HAXM, the Intel software that speeds up these devices, is working as expected. You'll also see the port number that's being used by this virtual device to communicate back to your version of Android Studio. If you then click in the Android Monitor window, on the Logcat tab, you'll see a bunch of messages start to come through from the device. And if that's the first time you clicked on the Android Monitor tab, you might see some other messages before these start appearing. I'll shrink down that window, and then I'll switch back to my virtual device. And I'm just going to wait for a few moments until the startup screen appears. If you have any trouble starting up the virtual device, you can close it down, then once again go to the AVD Manager, and you can completely wipe out the data on the device. Pull down the menu and choose Wipe Data and Confirm, and then start up the device again. Once you see this screen, your virtual device is live. If you see an introductory message, you can click the link to clear it, and then you can go back to Android Studio and try running your application again. This time, the device appears under Connected Devices, and I'll check the option to use the same selection for future launches, and click OK. And then I'll switch back to the virtual device and watch until the app appears. The first time you run the app in the virtual device, it might take a little while, but then as you make changes to your application, you want to keep that virtual device open. You won't have to completely relaunch the entire application. Instead, Android Studio uses a feature called Instant Run to incrementally update the app on the device. So incremental changes should launch very, very quickly. Now, once again, I'm seeing a white screen on my device, so I'm going to clear this application just by clicking the back button a couple of times. Then I'll come back to Android Studio and I'll completely rebuild the app. I'll choose Build, Clean Project, and then I'll watch the messages at the bottom of the screen that tell me that the app is being built. I'll also peek at the top toolbar, and if I see that the Stop button is red, I'll click it, and that will stop the current version of the app on the device. Then finally, when the rebuild is complete, I can click the Run button again, and this time the app should run successfully. And I see Hello World at the top and Hello World at the bottom, and I've successfully built and deployed an app to an Android virtual device.